Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of April. Today's speaker is Zoë Eisenman, and Zoe's title is Three Modes of Persuasion in Plato's Phaedo. This first Friday lecture is supported by gifts made in memory of basic program instructor Claudia Trout. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type into the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Zoe at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Zoe and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is entirely at your discretion. Zoe's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I'm the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. You can find links to more information in the chat box. The Basic Program is a 4-year, non-credit certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original thinkers in their original texts. Through focused discussion and close reading, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on May 3rd, when our speaker will be Simon Friedland. Simon's title will be Seeking the Land of the Greeks in My Soul, Ancient Greece in German Culture Around 1800. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Zoë Eisenman started teaching in the Basic Program in 1992 and served as the Cyril O'Hoole Chair from 2015 to 2020. She has a BA in Greek from Vassar College and an MA in Classics from the University of Chicago, where she has also done advanced graduate work. Her main academic focus is on Greek and Roman history and philosophy, classical cultural history, and gender studies. She taught in the college at the University of Chicago and in the philosophy department at St. Xavier University. She is the 2014 recipient of the Graham School's Excellence in Teaching Award for the Basic Program and is currently Director of Academics at the Graham School. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Zoe.
Thank you, Kendall. Let me get my PowerPoint going here. So hopefully everybody can see that. And thank you and welcome. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Phaedo. So for those of you who are in year 4 spring, I just wanted to say that, spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the end of the dialogue. So sorry about that, but here we go. Okay, so let me get my thing over here. There we go. All right. Plato's dialogue Phaedo tells the story of Socrates' last day. After being sentenced to death by the Athenians for atheism and corrupting the youth, the time has nearly come to drink the hemlock and die. Before that happens, he's able to have one last discussion with his friends and followers. Most of that discussion takes the form of an argument trying to prove that the soul is immortal, and that if one is a philosopher, one should not fear death, but welcome it as an improvement in the condition of one's immortal soul. Despite the fact that the people Socrates is arguing with are his friends and followers, he has a lot of difficulty convincing them that this is the case. I will argue that in the dialogue, Plato depicts Socrates as using 3 different methods of persuasion to try to convince them that philosophers should not fear death: rational argument, myth-making, and behavior or example. While we might expect that rational argument would play the largest role in a philosophical dialogue, I will argue that the rational argument is actually the least successful of the methods, and that behavior is the most successful. In addition, I will try to show that it is important to Plato to use all 3 methods in conjunction, and that the dialogue form allows him to try to combine these methods in a way that other literary forms could not. The dialogue begins with a framing narrative between 2 followers of Socrates, Echecrates and Phaedo. They meet in Phlius, a city in the northern Peloponnese, and Echecrates questions Phaedo about Socrates' death, which happened some time ago. He's heard about it, but doesn't know the details. Echecrates was someone sympathetic to Socrates' philosophy and is eager to hear the story. Phaedo himself was one of Socrates' close friends and associates, and was in the prison on the day of his death, and so can relate the whole story. This framing narrative carries on throughout the dialogue. Most of the dialogue consists of the story related by Phaedo, who describes the actions and discussions that took place that day in the jail cell. At certain strategic points in that account, Plato takes us back to Echecrates and Phaedo out of the narrative to have them comment on something or react to something. And Phaedo ends the dialogue with a statement of his own about Socrates, bringing us back to the time and place of the narrator. I'll return to the idea of this framing device later in my talk. The philosophical subject of the dialogue has given it the alternate title, On the Soul, since much of it centers on a discussion of whether or not the soul is immortal and what happens to the soul after death. Concern about what happens to us when we die is a natural topic in the situation, since Socrates is facing his own imminent demise, but it is also of crucial concern for anyone claiming to be a philosopher. The question of the immortality of the soul comes up because Socrates is attempting to convince his friends and followers that he is truly a philosopher and therefore does not fear death and in fact welcomes it as an improvement in his state of being. As a philosopher, he has cultivated his soul rather than his body, and is sure that the soul will go on to a better existence once it is freed or purified from the body. If that is indeed the case, his friends should not be upset that he's going to die, since he himself is not upset. In fact, he's sort of looking forward to it. Furthermore, for their own well-being, they also should try to become philosophers in order to live better lives by caring for their souls, and so be unafraid of death and anticipate a better afterlife themselves. Most of the people who are visiting Socrates and are involved in the discussion consider themselves to be students of philosophy, if not actual philosophers. All of them are friends and admirers of Socrates, and so are at least nominally favorable toward his beliefs and arguments. Many of them, in fact, went on to write philosophical dialogues or start schools of philosophy after Socrates' death, including Phaedo, our narrator. The 2 main interlocutors in the dialogue, Simmias and Cebes, are Theban philosophers who seem to be from the Pythagorean school, and so are particularly suited to discuss the nature of the soul and its fate, since Pythagoreans believed in reincarnation, the idea that the soul is reborn in a new body after death, and had many beliefs and practices that centered on dealing with the soul in the proper way. For example, they practiced vegetarianism, since they believed human souls could be reborn in animals, and vice versa. These men, and they are all men, have come to visit Socrates in jail every day in order to spend as much time with him as they can, showing their devotion to Socrates as a person and as a philosopher. Some, like his friend Phaedo, were ready to go to great effort and expense to try to help Socrates escape from jail and allow him to continue to live and practice philosophy elsewhere, an effort rebuffed and refused by Socrates. Unlike in the Apology, where Socrates' interlocutors and hearers, the prosecutor and jury, are unfavorable and indeed actively hostile to both Socrates and philosophy, in Phaedo, he has the most receptive audience he could hope for. Yet, despite these favorable circumstances, Socrates has a difficult time convincing his companions that he is not afraid of death and that they should not be either. And looking at the 3 forms of persuasion that are used in the dialogue, I will start with the rational argument. 63e, Socrates states his point. I want to make my argument before you, my judges, as to why I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death, and to be very hopeful that after death he will attain the greatest blessings yonder. I will try to tell you, Simmias and Cebes, how this may be so. I'm afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death. Now, if this is true, it would be strange indeed if they were eager for this all their lives and then resent it when what they have wanted and practiced for a long time comes upon them. This statement is the start of a Socratic investigation into what death really is. The argument begins with the premise that death is, quote, the separation of the soul from the body, unquote. Implied in this formulation is that the soul and the body are different things, and that they are separable, and that the soul is what provides life to the body. This idea is readily accepted by his audience and doesn't seem to require much argument. His friends seem to be already familiar with the idea that the soul is a separate thing and that the body dies when the soul leaves it. Whether it is the Homeric idea of the soul flying down to Hades as the body breathes its last, or the Pythagorean idea that the soul leaves the body to be reborn in another body, they all seem to accept that there are two elements to a human being, soul and body, and that the body is alive when there is a soul in it and dies when the soul leaves it. Starting from this initial premise, Socrates then begins his argument about the nature of the soul and the nature of this relationship between soul and body, and how a philosopher should think about that relationship. Here again, we have an assumption that is taken for granted by his hearers, that the philosopher is concerned with the soul and rejects the body. The body is the thing that feels and has senses that can interact with the physical world. It is visible and material, it breathes and eats, and has needs and desires. The soul is seen as the thing that reasons and knows things. Socrates is not viewing the brain as the bodily organ that thinks and where our consciousness exists. Instead, the soul is the seat of reason and self-awareness. It is not a physical body part, but something non-material and invisible. For Socrates' interlocutors, there isn't much doubt about the nature of the body, and there isn't doubt about the fact that there is a soul. However, there is doubt about the nature of the soul, since it is invisible and intangible. Once Socrates has established the basic natures of body and soul, and that death is the separation of the two, he starts making an argument about how a philosopher should deal with them. He goes on to enumerate things that are, quote, pleasures of the body, food and drink, sex, wealth, for example. He argues, and his hearers agree with him, that, quote, the philosopher, more than any other man, frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible, end quote, in order to focus his attention on the soul. Socrates then goes on to discuss knowledge and truth. Since the philosopher seeks knowledge and truth, he will avoid trying to perceive it with his bodily senses. For whenever it, the soul, attempts to examine anything with the body, it is clearly deceived by it. Is it not in reasoning, if anywhere, that any reality becomes clear to the soul, he says. This leads to a brief discussion of the forms, which are considered to be the true reality, and the idea that they can only be grasped by thought, not through the senses, and indeed that the body and senses actively impede the perception of truth with wants and desires. He concludes, quote, if we are ever to have pure knowledge, we must escape from the body and observe things in themselves with the soul by itself, end quote. So if one is truly a lover of wisdom, which is the literal meaning of philosopher, one's life goal is to get one's soul out of the corrupting clutches of the body so that it can join with the thing it loves, wisdom, in an unimpeded way. In other words, by the earlier definition, to die. Socrates' arguments show signs of, quote, preaching to the choir. Simmias' replies to Socrates are consistently in agreement, and every so often he goes out of his way to state that some of the main points are things which they have previously agreed upon. Cebes is not quite as acquiescent, but even he restates some of the points Socrates makes as things he has accepted from previous arguments. It is Cebes who explains the basics of the theory of recollection to Simmias, and he calls it an excellent argument, showing that he has encountered it before and accepts its conclusions. Socrates calls the forms, quote, those realities we are always talking about. So it sounds like they're discussing them frequently. And Simmias states, nothing is so evident to me personally as that all such things must certainly exist, the beautiful and the good, and all those things you mentioned just now. I also think sufficient proof has been given. Quote. Not everyone would so easily agree that it is evident that the forms exist. But it is clear that these are not new ideas to Simmias and Cebes. They have reasoned through these concepts with Socrates and accept them, and they actively want to be philosophers, thinking rationally about things and focusing on the soul. However, when it comes to following the argument to its logical end and applying these principles in real life, they still have difficulties. Despite their acceptance of the individual parts of the argument, what the body is, what the soul is, what a philosopher is, these wannabe philosophers have a hard time accepting Socrates' conclusion that a philosopher should be happy to die. Cebes is the one who starts looking for places in the argument to justify this lack of belief. He accepts everything as stated, except he thinks, quote, men find it very hard to believe what you said about the soul, end quote, that it is immortal. He says, this requires a good deal of faith and a persuasive argument to believe that the soul still exists after a man has died and it still possesses some capability and intelligence, end quote. If reason can prove that the soul is immortal, then belief should follow reason, right? Socrates tries to provide him with a persuasive argument, centering on the existence of the forms as the true reality, and one which cannot be perceived by bodily senses, but only by reasoning with the soul. He reasserts the theory of recollection that we first encountered in the Meno, that learning is not discovering new things, but really remembering the essences of things, the forms that we knew when our soul was not in the body. Quote, if those realities we are always talking about exist, the beautiful and the good and all that kind of reality, and we refer all the things that we perceive to that reality, discovering that it existed before and is ours, and we compare these things with it, then, just as they exist, so our soul must exist before we are born, end quote. In other words, we could only learn about the forms when the soul wasn't in a body, since we can't comprehend them with our physical senses. Socrates has presented a dualistic arrangement of the world. And there's a sort of chart of that, some of the things that fall into that dualistic arrangement. In this system, the things on each side of the chart are compatible with each other, but in opposition to the things on the other side of the chart. The two sides are also not equal. The invisible side is better, more true, more real than the visible side. Socrates argues to convince Simmias and Cebes that the soul truly belongs on the side of the forms, and that its defining form is indeed life. Quote, whatever the soul occupies, it always brings life to it. It does. And the form of life itself and anything that is deathless is never destroyed, end quote. So the soul, which always brings life with it, is deathless and cannot be destroyed, and is therefore immortal. As a result, we shouldn't be worried about the soul's fate outside the body, since it is immortal and the true seat of consciousness. When the body dies, the soul can carry on its business of being aware, unencumbered by the physical necessities of the body. Simmias and Cebes' arguments against the continued existence of the soul after death, the argument of harmony and the argument of the weaver and the cloak, which I'm not going to go into right now, are successfully demolished by Socrates, therefore proving the immortality of the soul. Despite their familiarity with the concept of the forms as the source of truth and basis of reality, and their acceptance of Socrates' reasoning that the soul must have had some prior knowledge of them when it was not in a body, proving the persistence of the soul, Simmias and Cebes, and presumably his other friends who are also listening, still struggle with the thought of death being a release of the soul to the realm of the forms, and so a consummation devoutly to be wished, as Hamlet might say. Even though they want to be philosophers and live by rational arguments, they are unable to let go their feelings about death, that death is frightening and bad. And an aside about this argument, Echecrates from the framing scene claims of Socrates' argument, I think he made these things wonderfully clear to anyone of even small intelligence. And Phaedo agrees and says everyone there agreed to the argument too. And yet, at the end of the argument, Simmias says, quote, I myself have no remaining grounds for doubt after what has been said. Nevertheless, in view of the importance of our subject and my low opinion of human weakness, I am bound still to have some private misgivings about what we have said, end quote. The rational argument is not enough to get rid of his misgivings. Socrates notices their hesitation early in the progress of this discussion. After concluding his first argument about what the soul, why the soul goes on after death. Oops, hold on. There we go. He says jokingly, I think you and Simmias would like to discuss the argument more fully. You seem to have this childish fear that the wind would really dissolve and scatter the soul as it leaves the body, especially if one happens to die in a high wind and not in calm weather. End quote. Simmias and Cebes can assent to the reasoning of the argument, and that they can assert that the forms exist and that the soul is akin to them, since it is the part that can perceive them. But this reasoning isn't enough to relieve them of the fear of death. They keep finding objections, showing that understanding the argument is not enough for someone to truly believe it and act on it. Simmias says, quote, perhaps there's a child in us who has these fears. Try to persuade him not to fear death like a bogey. And Socrates replied, you should sing a charm over him every day until you have charmed away his fears. Rather than trying to reiterate the rational argument, Socrates accepts Simmias' notion of this inner child that has irrational fears that will not be stilled by reason. Instead, he recommends another method, singing a charm or incantation to soothe that fear. That comment brings me to Socrates' next method of persuasion, myth or poetry. At several points in the dialogue, Socrates mentions that he's working on being a poet. For those who are familiar with the Republic and Socrates' concerns about poets and animosity towards imitation in that dialogue, it may seem surprising that Plato starts out the Phaedo by pointing out that Socrates has been writing poetry in jail. Socrates has been having a recurring dream that tells him, quote, Socrates, practice and cultivate the arts. In the past, I imagined that it was instructing and advising me to do what I was doing, such as those who encourage runners in a race, that the dream was thus bidding me to do the very thing I was doing, namely to practice the art of philosophy, this being the highest kind of art. And I was doing that. But now, after my trial took place and the festival of the god was preventing my execution, I thought that, in case my dream was bidding me to practice this popular art, I should not disobey it, but compose poetry. Shortly after that, when Simmias and Cebes ask him what he knows about the prohibition against suicide, he says, quote, I do not mind telling you what I have heard, for it is perhaps most appropriate for one who's about to depart yonder to tell and examine tales about what we believe that journey to be like, end quote. And the telling tales part is the mythologein, to mythologize. Toward the end of the dialogue, Socrates compares himself to a swan. They sing before too, but when they realize that they must die, they sing most and most beautifully, as they rejoice that they are about to depart to join the god whose servants they are. They are prophetic and have knowledge of the future and sing of the blessings of the underworld, end quote. Socrates connects poetry and song with the god Apollo, and the poet or swan who makes songs about death in a prophetic way is obeying the god's commands. Plato shows that Socrates himself has become a poet, using the power of mythic storytelling in addition to the logic of rational argument. At the end of his argument with Simmias and Cebes, he reiterates his logical conclusions by telling them a myth about what happens to the soul when it leaves the body. The myth reiterates the dualistic view of the world laid out in his argument about the forms and shows the future for the philosophic soul. Quote, those who have purified themselves sufficiently by philosophy live in the future altogether without a body. They make their way to even more beautiful dwelling places, which it is hard to describe clearly, end quote. Those who have not been philosophers are too tangled up with the body and end up suffering torments of various kinds. And even if they eventually get to live another life, they sometimes end up as donkeys or ants, while the worst evildoers are stuck suffering in Tartarus forever. As he tells the myth about the nature of the world, the afterlife, and the fate of the soul, Socrates says, indeed, if this is the moment to tell a tale, Simmias, it is worth hearing about the nature of things on the surface of the earth under the heavens. At any rate, Socrates, says Simmias, we should be glad to hear this story. So, and again, the word he's using is mythos. At the end of his story, Socrates says, oops, sorry, I've gone too far. Yeah, here we go. No sensible man would insist that these things are as I have described them. But I think it is fitting for a man to risk the belief, for the risk is a noble one, that this, or something like this, is true about our souls and their dwelling places, since the soul is evidently immortal, and a man should repeat this to himself as if it were an incantation, which is why I have been prolonging my tale. Again, this story is not a logical argument, but a myth, a tale. Socrates says it is fiction. No man would insist things are as he describes them. It is a poetic incantation, the lullaby or magic spell that Simmias had asked for earlier, to reassure the inner child who is not convinced by logic that things are going to work out. In the Republic, Socrates banishes Homer and tragic poets from his ideal city. This has led to some people to argue that Plato rejects poetry, and especially imitation of people and things, as corrupting and deceptive. However, I would argue that it is not poetry itself that Plato rejects, but improper use of poetry. He finds it dangerous just because it is so powerful, speaking directly to the soul and molding our emotions. The tragedians and epic poets use poetry to manipulate and train people's emotions to feel and value things that Plato thinks are problematic. He sees Homer using the power of words and music to make people believe that death is bad, that the gods are unjust, and that it is right for men to be jealous and hate each other. But if poetry were used in the service of philosophy, it could use that same power of words and music to convey the truth to people in a way that they would understand not just intellectually, but emotionally. Throughout the Republic, Socrates uses imagery, similes, and parables to explain his main ideas, like the parable of the cave or the image of the divided line or the beast and its trainer. At the end of the Republic, Plato has Socrates tell his hearers a myth about the nature of the universe and the soul. He's been trying to explain this concept throughout using logical reasoning, but since language is an imperfect means of communicating thought, he falls back on poetry, creative imagery, and imitation to inspire belief in his argument. And there's the diagram of the divided line from the Republic. If we think about it in terms of that image of the divided line, so we have the least real over here at A and the most real up here over here at E. The least real end of the spectrum, we have shadows and imitations, then physical things, then mathematical ideas, which are expressed through number, then the real things, the forms, which can only be truly understood by dialectic thought, but which are expressed by humans through imitation and shadows. Just as in the Republic, in the Phaedo, poetry becomes a means through which the will of the gods and the true nature of philosophy is expressed in a way that speaks both to the intellect and to the emotions, to the inner child that is afraid of the dark and needs an incantation to really believe what his mind tells him is true. In the Phaedo, Socrates is thus using a combination of rational argument and poetry or myth-making to try to convince his friends that death is to be welcomed, not feared, by one who is truly a philosopher. However, we see that even this combination is unsuccessful. There are moments where the listeners seem fully convinced of Socrates' reasoning, and they are caught up in awe of the myth of the soul's journey through the underworld and its destination to the pure world of the forms, but these effects are not long-lasting. They soon find objections to bring up to Socrates' arguments, and despite the beauty of his myth, when reality sets back in, they are not able to keep to their convictions. Plato shows us the difficulty of persuading even the most favorable audience by these means throughout the dialogue, largely due to the power of emotions. When Phaedo first starts to describe Socrates' last day, he tells us that there were a lot of conflicting emotions. Quote, I had a strange feeling, an unaccustomed mixture of pleasure and pain at the same time as I reflected that he was just about to die. All of us present were affected in much the same way, sometimes laughing, then weeping, especially Apollodorus, you know the man and his ways, end quote. Socrates' wife Xanthippe is also there, and her weeping is so disturbing that Socrates has her taken home in an attempt to calm these emotions. But throughout the dialogue, they reemerge among his friends. His friends are concerned to try to make things easy on Socrates since he is facing death, a situation they assume will trouble him. Phaedo worries that Socrates will get too worked up for the poison to work quickly, which will cause him pain and fear. Simmias and Cebes are wary of upsetting Socrates by arguing against him, quote, in his current situation. Phaedo in particular seems to be unconvinced by either the logical argument or the myth that Socrates is told. When he asks Socrates how they should bury him, Socrates teases him. In any way you like, said Socrates, if you can catch me and I do not escape you. and laughing quietly, looking at us, he said, I do not convince Crito that I am this Socrates talking to you here and ordering all I say, but he thinks that I am that thing which he will be soon looking at as a corpse, and so he asks how he shall bury me. I have been saying for some time and at some length that after I have drunk the poison, I shall no longer be with you, but will leave you to go and enjoy some good fortunes of the blessed. But it seems that I have said all this to him in vain in an attempt to reassure you and myself too. Give a pledge to Crito on my behalf, he said, the opposite pledge to that he gave the jury. He pledged that I would stay. You must pledge that I will not stay after I die, but that I shall go away, so that Crito will bear it more easily when he sees my body being burned or buried, and will not be angry on my behalf, as if I were suffering terribly, so that he should not say at the funeral that he is laying out or carrying out or burying Socrates. Crito has not accepted the ideas that Socrates had been arguing for, that his soul will leave his body, purified by philosophy, and go on to a better existence, even though he wants to believe him. In the moment, caught up in emotions, he can't let go of the idea that the death of the physical body is the death of the person. One could say that in many ways, the failure to believe Socrates stems not from a fear of death itself or the fate of Socrates that Socrates himself would suffer, but from the fear of loss. Socrates' friends are suffering because of the harm to themselves, not to Socrates. Phaedo relates, quote, we all felt as if we had lost a father and would be orphaned for the rest of our lives, end quote. They feel he is irreplaceable and they will suffer by his death. Cebes asks him, quote, where shall we find a good charmer for these fears, Socrates, now that you are leaving us, end quote. When asked if there is someone who can give an account of the forms, Simmias says, quote, I'm afraid it's much more likely that by this time tomorrow, there will be no one left who can do so adequately, end quote. And Crito tells him when he's ready to drink the poison, do not hurry, there's still some time. When Socrates drinks the poison, Phaedo relates, most of us had been able to hold back our tears reasonably well up till then, but when we saw him drinking it, and after he drank it, we could hold them back no longer. My own tears came in floods against my will. So I covered my face. I was weeping for myself, not for him, for my misfortune in being deprived of such a comrade. End quote. Even though they want to be philosophers, even though they want to follow the reasoning of their arguments, they can't seem to keep their emotions in line with their minds. As Socrates says, really, Simmias, it would be hard for me to persuade other people that I do not consider my present fate a misfortune, if I cannot persuade even you. Their self-pity and fear increase their emotional upset and inhibit their ability to be convinced by the reasoning and myths Socrates presents them with. So what finally convinces them that the philosopher doesn't fear death and that the soul carries on? Socrates' actions. This brings us back to the framing discussion between Phaedo and Echecrates that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. A good amount of time has passed since Socrates' execution and the meeting and conversation of Phaedo and Echecrates. However, the effects of Socrates' actions have had a lasting effect on Phaedo, a much stronger effect than the logical argument or even the myths that Socrates used. When Simmias and Cebes bring up arguments against the immortality of the soul, Echecrates is quite thrown. Oops. I find myself saying to myself, what argument shall we trust? Tell me then, by Zeus, how Socrates tackled the argument. Was he obviously distressed, as you say people were? Or was he not, but quietly came to the rescue of his argument? And did he do so satisfactorily or inadequately? And Phaedo responds, quote, I have certainly often admired Socrates, Echecrates, but never more than on this occasion. That he had a reply perhaps was not strange. What I wondered at most in him was the pleasant, kind, and admiring way he received the young men's argument, and how sharply he was aware of the effect the discussion had on us, and then how well he healed our distress, and, as it were, recalled us from our flight and defeat, and turned us around to join him in the examination of the argument. It is Socrates' attitude, emotional awareness, and his personal composure that has had a lasting effect on Phaedo, more than the argument itself. Throughout the dialogue, Socrates' demeanor is sharply contrasted with that of his friends. He is completely consistent. When his friends first arrive, they find him musing quietly on the idea of pleasure and pain, since he has just had his chains removed. He smiles and jokes with them as they go about the discussion, never showing any signs of fear or grief. He shows no emotion when drinking the poison. Quote, he drained it calmly and easily. The only thing that seems to disturb him at all is the emotional outbursts of others. Early on, he has his wife sent away when she starts wailing. And then after drinking the poison, he rebukes Apollodorus and others for weeping and carrying on. Quote, what is this, he said, you strange fellows? It is mainly for this reason that I sent the women away, to avoid such unseemliness. For I am told one should die in good omened silence. So keep quiet and control yourselves. Once they have calmed down, Socrates lets the poison take effect and says his final words, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering to him and do not forget. This offering is one made by someone who is recovered from an illness. So the implication is that even at the very end, Socrates sees death is a cure and a restoration to health for his soul. He shows no fear. The emphasis on actions might seem strange in light of one of the things Socrates seems most concerned about in the dialogue, Misology, the hatred of reasoned argument. When the argument hits a setback, his hearers are all dismayed. Socrates exclaims to Phaedo, what argument shall we trust? Socrates is concerned that people will mistrust argument entirely and so abandon the search for truth. He says of Misology, it is when one who lacks skill in arguments puts his trust in an argument as being true, then shortly afterwards believes it to be false, as sometimes it is and sometimes it is not, and so with another argument and then another. You know how those in particular who spend their time studying contradiction in the end believe themselves to have become very wise, and that they alone have understood that there is no soundness or reliability in any object or in any argument, but that all that exists simply fluctuates up and down, as if it were in the Euripus, and does not remain in the same place for any time at all. It would be pitiable, Phaedo, he said, when there is a true and reliable argument and one that can be understood, if a man who has dealt with such arguments as appear at one time true, at another time untrue, should not blame himself or his own lack of skill, but because of his distress, in the end gladly shift the blame away from himself to the arguments, and spend the rest of his life hating and reviling reasoned discussion, and so be deprived of truth and the knowledge of reality. This concern is important to Socrates for a couple of reasons. First, his own arguments frequently end without a solid answer, and that can be very frustrating for his interlocutors. Why should someone continue to trust in logic if the arguments lead to no conclusions? Secondly, Socrates is always concerned about the effect of the sophists on people. Their paradoxical arguments can leave the hearers with the conclusion that there is no certainty, that all arguments can be contradicted, and so why bother? Most people see no difference between philosophers and sophists. Simmias reflects this in his joke about philosophers, that most people think, quote, philosophers are nearly dead, and that the majority of men is well aware that they deserve to be, end quote. It is somewhat ironic that Plato seems to show that the cure for misology is actions, rather than logic itself, since the way that he shows us the validity of rational discussion is not through the logical conclusions that Socrates reaches, which fail to totally convince his friends, but through his actions that show his conviction in his pursuit of truth and reason. If he was just making arguments for the sake of perplexing people and showing off, we might expect him to change his tune once he knows that death is imminent. However, Socrates faces death in a way that indicates he believes his arguments are true, even if they can't be logically proven. If we are looking for proof that the true philosopher does not fear death, and that this is something that is indeed possible for a human being to accomplish, Socrates' behavior gives us that proof. Plato does not depict Socrates as being more than human. He feels pain and is relieved when his chains are removed. He has a wife and children, even though he doesn't pay much attention to them. He enjoys talking with his friends as well as with the guard or other people. Yet Phaedo is convinced that Socrates truly did not fear death because he saw him fearlessly drink the poison and die peacefully. Socrates didn't fall apart when the time came to follow through on dying. He didn't try to back out of it, delay it, or escape, even though he was given plenty of opportunities. Instead, his strong philosophical convictions enabled him to face death with equanimity and to set an example for his friends. Phaedo has clearly been strongly affected by Socrates' example. He tells Socrates, "Nothing gives me more pleasure than to call Socrates to mind. whether talking about him myself or listening to someone else do so. And Echecrates replies, quote, your hearers will surely be like you in this, Phaedo. Even after a long period of time, Plato shows us that the effect of Socrates' example is lasting for both the direct witness and for the person he tells about it. For the reader as well, the scene of Socrates' death is very powerful. We may not believe his myth of the afterlife, and we can poke holes in his argument about the nature of the soul, but we can see that there is something to be admired in his actions, and that a way of life that leads to those kinds of actions is something to aspire to. Plato could not have presented this scene effectively if he had been writing a philosophical treatise. The dialogue form allows us to witness Socrates' actions, as well as to see the impact that the story of those actions has on Phaedo and Echecrates. By using a dramatic form, Plato is able to build up Socrates as a character in a consistent way, so that we get to know him over the course of the dialogue. By having the reader be both sort of on the scene, as well as witnessing the long-term effects of Socrates' influence on Phaedo and Echecrates through the mechanism of the framing scenes, the reader gets the twofold impact of the story. In a sense, Plato is using the dialogue form as another way to press poetry into the service of philosophy. The goal of his drama is to imitate words and actions that will encourage the listener to pursue philosophy as a way of life and so not fear death. We can be persuaded by the combination of Socrates' arguments, myths, and especially his behavior, even though he's no longer with us. The reactions of Phaedo and Echecrates model a successful response to the drama. Both of them still want to talk about Socrates and his ideas, and see Socrates as a role model. Plato has perhaps selected these particular men for the framing scene because they are good examples of students of Socrates who continued to pursue a philosophical life after Socrates' death. By identifying with Phaedo and Echecrates, the reader is further encouraged in taking Socrates' actions as a guide for behavior. To conclude, in the Phaedo, Plato has shown Socrates using 3 different methods to persuade his followers to practice philosophy in their lives, and that if they do so, they should not fear death. By engaging in philosophical reasoning, Socrates and his friends seek to better understand the truth, exercising their souls in the use of reason and preparing them to be free of the body and death. By telling myths, Socrates appeals to the emotional side of human nature, the inner child that still needs to have its fears soothed, even when the reason is willing. And finally, through his actions, Socrates demonstrates that a human being is actually capable of following through on the ideas and beliefs that he has argued for, despite their seeming difficulty or even impossibility. Plato gives us the reactions of Phaedo and Echecrates to show us the lasting impact of Socrates' lessons and to encourage us as readers also to be persuaded. And I'll finish with the last statement that Phaedo gives us about Socrates. He says, such was the end of our comrade Echecrates, a man who, we would say, was of all those we have known the best and also the wisest and the most upright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe. And we have a few questions from the audience that I will toggle over here to. And let me say to everybody in the audience that there is still time to type questions. So I'll keep an eye on incoming. I see, oh, that was Kate Lynch raising a hand. Kate, so if you want to just type your question into the Q&A, I'll pose it to Zoe. So Zoe, the first question comes from Barbara Reynolds, and Barbara asks in a cheerful tone, why not commit suicide early on? What does the soul do while contained and inhibited by the body?
Well, Socrates goes through a quite long explanation in the Phaedo of why you shouldn't commit suicide. And it really has to do with the fact that this arrangement of body and soul is something that the gods have concocted, right? So our human condition is created by the gods. And he argues that since the gods clearly wanted us to be, souls stuck in bodies, and that we are at the sort of the disposal of the gods, right? That the gods are our masters, so-called, that we should not go against their wishes and take ourselves out of our bodies without their say-so. So, again, the idea that you would decide on your own takes away the obedience to the gods for Socrates, and therefore you should stay into your body until the gods indicate or do something to you that takes it out. So in Socrates' case, even though he's, you could make an argument, a pretty good argument, I would say, that Socrates lets himself in for this execution and that there are ways he could have avoided it. He does make statements periodically that talk about why he doesn't do that. In particular, in the Apology, he talks about his little voice that he hears, his daimon. And he says that at no time did the daimon tell him he was making a mistake by behaving as he did during the trial. So the argument there is that, he's, by getting himself convicted and set up for execution, the gods would have warned him if that was a bad idea or they didn't want him to do that. And since they don't warn him, he's on the right path, and therefore this is what he's supposed to be doing. So a lot of it comes down to following the will of the gods there. Hopefully that answers it.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Barbara. Barbara, if you have a follow-up, just type it into the chat and I'll put it in the queue to ask Zoe. And let's see, our second question comes from Matt Sparapani, who asks, what is the Greek word used for art in the quote discussing Socrates's dream? Would you please comment on that word and compare contrast that with our modern understanding of art?
I don't have the Greek with me at the moment.
I do.
Do you happen to know what it is?
Yeah, it's musike.
Musike, okay, yeah, because yeah, so, and again, that is something that in Plato and in other places, it's music in the sense that we think of music, but it also includes sort of words in rhythm, right? And this idea of sort of harmonious actions and construction of harmonious sounds and actions. So that's what's going on with that, I would say. So it's not art in the general. I mean, we tend to use art as like all the arts or something like that. This is more, musique is more based on verbal and rhythmic types of art.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Matt. The next question. What's that?
Thanks for providing the Greek.
Oh, right on. Yeah, I saw the question about 30 minutes ago, Jerry Ree asks, I wonder if you wouldn't mind speculating on a metaphor by the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who likened himself to a wasp in a bottle, a kind of gadfly. Clearly, he's practicing dying since he's so trapped. What should we do?
Goodness. Well, I'm not sure exactly what to comment on. I mean, the idea of a wasp in a bottle, yeah, that certainly sounds trapped. And, certainly I would say Socrates does talk about himself as being a gadfly, as somebody who irritates people to get them to think about things or get them to change their behavior. But I'm not quite sure how this particular philosopher that you're quoting is intending it, so I'm not sure I can say anything really useful about that.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Jerry. Donna Jensen comments, I'm going to turn it into a question. Were poetry and music the social media of ancient Greece?
Well, yeah, you could sort of say that. I mean, they are sort of, again, very public things. They're things that people tend to do communally. So there's a lot of like choral song and things like that people do together. And there's a sense, especially, as I referenced in the Republic, that these songs, the sounds of the songs, the music part, the rhythm part of them, the words themselves, right? That these are things that impact us very, very deeply, that they speak directly to our souls in a certain way. And that as you sort of, grow up listening to certain kinds of music or poems or speech, you're sort of training your soul to think in certain directions or feel things in a certain way, right? So to find certain things beautiful, to find certain things uplifting. And so, sort of like the algorithms in social media that start to sort of veer you off the sort of middle ground into more and more extreme kinds of thoughts. They sort of re-emphasize or reinforce your beliefs and your inclinations. Music, according to Plato, it seems, can do similar things. It can reinforce beliefs or inclinations or steer you in a certain direction. And again, perhaps in another parallel to social media, you may not be aware of that. This may be happening without you being conscious of it. And so again, it's very powerful and dangerous in the wrong hands. So yeah, there could be some interesting comparisons there.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Donna, for your question. The next question comes from Michael Callahan, and I'm also going to join this up with a question that comes a little bit later from Nina Eisenman. And so Michael's version is regarding ideas or ideals, what about truth? And Nina Eisenman asks, what are the forms? Are they like states of being?
Well, what are the forms is a really big question, and ideas and ideals. I mean, all of these are different names for the forms. I mean, the forms is sort of the typical English translation of idea, but it's sort of the essence of whatever the thing is, right? And so, in Plato's view, as far as we can tell, that those forms or those essences are the true reality, right? That's the thing that's really the thing in and of itself. And to go back to that chart I put out there, they are unified, unchanging, eternal, always the thing itself, and can't be anything else, right? So there's a lot of difficulty thinking about these things, but the idea of I'm going to sort of focus on the unity and the multiplicity. So the idea that you'd have the form of a something, right, or of an idea of a concept, so like beauty, or people like to use chairs, although I tend not to use a physical thing, but that the form is the thing itself, right? It never changes. It's one, it exists. And then there's many sort of derivations of that thing in the physical world. So lots of chairs, lots of kinds of beauty, lots of manifestations of that are changing and subjective and mortal. They come and they go. They grow and they die. There's a lot of flux going on there, and multiplicity. And so again, for Plato, the forms are the truth, right? That's the true nature of the thing, and you try to get closer to that idea of that thing, the form of the thing, through this idea of dialectical discourse. That you can't do it by gathering up lots of examples for a method, for example. So in order to understand beauty, you wouldn't go around collecting lots of different ideas about beauty and put them all together and say, okay, this is going to help us understand beauty. Instead, you try to get at the essence of beauty and then see that reflected in all the little examples. And the way you get at that essence is through this dialectical argument. But as I said, language is imperfect and difficult. And so very often to try to talk about the forms, Plato is sort of forced to rely on imagery or similes or examples that are not just straight up dialectic conversation, but are pictures, basically, or images of it. And so it's sort of ironic that the sort of least real thing in his schema is how we end up talking about what he considers to be the most real things, or the truths about things. So hopefully that makes some sense. It's a big topic.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Michael and Nina, for your questions. The next question comes from Paxton Murphy, who asks that the soul continues after death. Is that where the Christian position of the idea of life after death originated?
Probably not. I mean, there's lots of different cultures and places that people, have ideas about the soul continuing after death. I mean, you find it in Egypt, you find it in, Near Eastern cultures. I mean, I'm just picking a random selection. The Pythagoreans, for example, believed that the soul was reincarnated. There's a lot of different cultures that have this idea of some kind of immortal soul that keeps going after death. It's just sort of what that means can be different. So, again, I mentioned Homer. In Homer, really the shades are very insubstantial. It's not like they're doing anything active down in Hades. They're just sort of there. And it's not until you like do something like feed them blood or something that they can talk and interact and really be, things that we would consider to be an active afterlife. Other cultures, you have the idea that your ancestors are watching over you, right? That they're somewhere and they're sort of still involved in the world, and they come, there's ways to get them more involved or less involved. The Pythagoreans thought the soul just got reborn in another body, and so in that way, it's carrying on, maybe not as you yourself, but as something else. And there's some fun stories about Pythagoras supposedly remembering his past lives and things like that. But so yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different places where we get that concept. It's just the details are often different as to how that works out.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Paxton, for your question. The next question comes from Ray Lucchese, who asks, why do you think that Plato was said not to be there at Socrates' death?
Well, I mean, Plato never puts himself into any of his dialogues, first of all, which is interesting. He does not have himself as a character in any of them. And so again, he's deliberately removed him when, some of these, the more historical ones, you could argue, okay, maybe that's historically accurate, but in others you could say, well, why wouldn't he put him in? It's an imagined dialogue. He could have easily put himself in there, but he doesn't like to. So I do think there's something in Plato that's keeping distance. In the Apology, we're told he was ill, and that's why he wasn't there. There's different reasons why he doesn't show up. But I tend to think that he's, taking himself out of these dialogues as the author of them, and that's why he doesn't show up. But yeah, I mean, you would imagine he seems to be the most faithful follower, maybe. You would think he would be there, but no, he doesn't put himself there.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Ray, for your question. The next question comes from Soterios Polychronopoulos, who asks, I don't see much difference between the Last Supper of Jesus and Socrates' last discussion with his disciples. Why did Jesus's message become more successful?
Well, I think maybe Jesus had an easier sell. If you're in order to save your soul, all you have to do is believe in Jesus and follow that path and be forgiven for all your sins. That's pretty easy. Being a philosopher is not easy. I mean, one of the things I was trying to stress is that this life that Socrates is telling people to follow is very hard. You're not engaged with your body very much. You're not interested in pleasure or wealth. You're not doing things in the normal way that people normally do. And to focus entirely on your soul in your daily life and spend your life in active reasoning and argument to try to reach the truth constantly. That's pretty strenuous. So maybe Jesus was a better salesman. I don't know.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Soterios, for your question. The next question comes from Mark Herman, who asks, Socrates relies on the gods for many things. How could he have been convicted of being an atheist?
Yes. Well, it's all about whose belief about the gods you're looking at. So the idea of the atheism charge was that he did not believe in the gods of the city and that he was bringing in new gods. And that daimon that I referenced earlier may have been one of the sources of that charge, that he was bringing in some kind of new and different deities that were not approved of by Athens. He did tell people that he had this divine voice that spoke to him, and therefore that's not very orthodox. Not many people had something like that, so that could be seen as problematic. Again, I think Plato goes to great lengths to show Socrates as being somebody who was devoted to the gods and to the sort of so-called normal gods. He's constantly referencing Apollo. He says things like by Zeus. he talks about doing things in the established ways, right? And if you have a question about religion, you should go ask Delphi and get an answer there. So I do think that Plato sort of was at pains to demonstrate Socrates, or to depict Socrates as somebody who did follow sort of the normal gods of the city, but that was a sort of trumped up charge, right? That they were looking for things to bring up against Socrates, and the daimon thing was really the in for that.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Mark. The next question comes from Mark Eleveld, who asks, this is not the centerpiece of this dialogue, but I wonder if Socrates were younger, not 70 years old, I wonder if he would embrace these ideas as much.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a question, right? It's, when somebody is 70 as opposed to 25, are they as willing to go through and die for their beliefs and their cause? And again, we really don't know. We have very sketchy details about, we know some things about Socrates' life. We know he did fight for his city. He was in the army and went into battle during the Peloponnesian War. So, there's a place where he was willing to put his life on the line when he was younger. In the Symposium, he talks about rescuing Alcibiades on the battlefield and things like that. So he was not averse to risk in his younger days, but we don't really know, how long he was, so devoted to philosophy, or, how long Athens was so opposed to him. I mean, it seems like a lot of his legal troubles came fairly late in life. But I mean, I think it's a good question to ask, because, given that at 70, he might have thought, well, I don't really have that much more time left anyway. Maybe that's easier than it would have been earlier.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Mark, for your question. The next question comes from Bill Spears, who asks, would the emotions that Socrates' disciples show be an example of the body that is opposed to the soul?
Well, yeah. So generally, where the emotions come from is a little tricky. And Socrates sort of tends to, and Plato too, tend to be a little bit vague. So sometimes we have some feelings and emotions that are in the soul, as part of the soul, right? We have this, like, desires and wants and things like that are in the soul. And then at other times they talk about them as though they are bodily things, right? That they're coming from the body. So it's a little hard to be accurate. But I guess what I would say is that they are not based in reason. So one of the things he seems to be, both Socrates and Plato both seem to be trying to get at, is that reason should be in charge, right? That the emotions should be subordinated to reason and controlled by reason. But clearly they aren't. And so, it could be that it's the body, these aspects of the body that sort of pull emotions away from reason, from the control of reason, or it could be just that emotional part of your soul is not as disciplined as you would like. But it's not 100%. Certainly, Socrates and Plato both depict emotions as being given more rein when you indulge bodily pleasures. So when it comes to, like, pleasure and pain, those kind of things can give your emotions more power. So when you're consumed by pleasures, or when you're consumed by pains, your emotions tend to, take over a bit more, and it's harder for reason to put them under control. So there's at least a connection between body and emotion. It's just not always specific as to how it works.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Bill, for your question. The next question comes from Michael Paulson, who asks, does Socrates' myth of recollection fit in with your argument? If so, how? I, for one, struggle with this idea.
Well, yeah, sort of. I don't know that it fits with my argument. I mean, it's certainly trying to show that, the way we know things is not, by discovering them or finding them out new, but by recognizing them. And you could make a case to say that that requires actions, right? You have to actively go through and try to recover them and do these arguments and practice to try to get them back. But that's sort of, I think that's a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, because that's really what dialectic is supposed to be doing, right? You're supposed to be practicing reason and arguing and logic and trying to work on it that way. So again, I mean, I think that's probably more the way that recollection is thought to work in this. The action is more just the response, I guess. I mean, that's really where it comes out in recollection, is that sort of aha moment where you do see the truth. You could say that that's in some ways an action, but again, I think it's a little shaky.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Michael, for your question. The next question comes from Teresa Betts-Cobo, who asks, why is this called a dialogue when it may actually be a monologue? Characters are just that, characters, and those characters tee up questions for Socrates. So it's like a chess player playing against him or herself. Also, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane asked God, please remove this cup if it is thy will. Jesus did not go willingly or happily to the crucifixion.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, as far as the monologue thing goes, I mean, I think actually the Phaedo has got a lot more interlocutor action than a lot of the Platonic dialogues do. You know, the Republic in some ways is more monologue-y. You know, there's certainly, I mean, in some places, the Meno too is very monologue-y. But in the Phaedo, the you know, Simmias and Cebes are both given actual real arguments, and disagree with Socrates, and you know, bring up points that they're making rather than he's making, and he has to refute them. So I do think that there's a bit more of that going on in this particular dialogue. But yeah, I mean, my real argument about the dialogue form is that, you know, there's always that question, why not just write, you know, a treatise about the forms, right? Why why have a dialogue to try to show Socrates explaining about, you know, having these arguments about the forms with his friends? Why not just write a dialogue about it, where a treatise about it, where you could lay it all out in orderly fashion and whatever. And I do think that this idea of acting it out, right, of having the reader empathize with the characters, see people as people, find places where they would interject, right? So I do think that there's a lot of places where, as a reader, we're meant to say, well, why doesn't that guy challenge him on that point? That doesn't make any sense. And we're supposed to sort of put ourselves in there and try to do that on our own. That's part of what the dialogue form is about. So even the more monologue-y ones, I think, leave openings for the reader to take the discussion off in a branching area and do that on their own, which treatises tend not to allow for as much.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Teresa, for your question. The next question comes from Noah Dennis, who asks, you mentioned that the essence of the soul is life in the Phaedo versus, my understanding, motion in the Phaedrus. Can you comment?
I guess. Yeah, I mean, a big part of the argument in the Phaedo is that the soul is basically intertwined with the form of life, of being alive, right? And that one of the big arguments hinges on that fact, that it's accompanied by this form of life and cannot be there without it, right? And so again, this is very important if we want to think about the fact that when the soul leaves the body, okay, the body clearly dies and decomposes and is dead. There's nothing going on there. How do we know the soul doesn't just sort of fall apart or blow away or whatever? And so this idea of having the form of life being inextricably associated with the soul is a way to argue that, well, the reason the body dies is because life goes with the soul when it leaves, right? And so therefore, since life and death, these two opposite forms, cannot be in the same thing, one, you know, they can't coexist. And since the soul is the thing that brings life to the body, then life is going to stay with the soul. So the soul is still going to be existing. The soul cannot be destroyed. Okay, it cannot admit death. So again, I think for this particular dialogue, that's why he's focusing on this idea of life as being the main thing that's involved with the soul, as opposed to motion.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Noah, for your question. Now, the next question comes from our own Noah Shafetz, who asks, well, first of all, he declares quite rightly, that was a really interesting talk. Thanks, Zoe. Do you think that Socrates' persuasive aims within the dialogue are different in any big and important ways from Plato's persuasive aims in writing the dialogue?
Yes, to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tried to maybe overemphasize is the idea that this dialogue is about philosophers. I mean, these guys all want to be philosophers. And so, for Socrates to persuade them shouldn't be that hard. They should be most of the way there already. And yet it's still difficult for them to get over this innate, idea that death is bad. I think in general, the dialogues are perhaps aimed at, certainly people who do want to be philosophers, but maybe aren't far enough on the path yet, or as far down the path. And so again, that's part of where I see that reinforcement of the framing mechanism coming in, that it gives us somebody to identify with as a reader, to say, okay, here's some more convincing that this is a good idea, this idea of being a philosopher and devoting ourselves to this kind of, learning and study and way of living. And so that for the reader, the dialogues are meant to persuade a little, somebody who maybe isn't as far committed to being a philosopher already. But that's sort of a speculation.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Noah, for your question. We have another question from Nina Eisenman, who asks, are there other examples of Socrates using action to prove an argument or to teach?
Well, I would say in the Apology, that's the case also. Again, I mean, he's doing a lot of verbal dancing in the Apology, but he also, at the end of that dialogue, at the end of that speech, because that one is more monologue-y, that's pretty much, all him talking. He talks about, he just sort of, his demeanor shows that he's not worried or afraid or upset, right? The way he finishes that up, he doesn't curse the jury, he doesn't, yell and scream about anything or whatever. He just says, okay, this was meant to be, and I think I'm going to be in a good place, and you guys are probably going to regret this, but it's okay. And I think his attitude in the courtroom there is meant to be a place where we look at his behavior, the way he treats his cross-examination of Meletus, the way he treats the jury, the way he treats the whole business of the charges. I think, again, his demeanor is meant to be something that we pay attention to.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Nina, for your question. We have another question from Barbara Reynolds, who asks, does one have to accept that the soul is immortal? In other words, just believe it or not? And then related, did the gods approve of the sentence of Socrates? Disbeliever here, Barbara adds.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, according to Socrates, they did, because, like I said, his little daimon would have told him do something else if it was going to be something the gods didn't want him to do. So we only have his word to take for it. So that's the best I can do there. Do we have to believe that the soul is immortal? Part of I think what's interesting about the whole question is, I was sort of Socrates never gives the same story about what happens to the soul, right? So we hear different stories in different dialogues from Socrates about what's going to happen to your soul when you die, and none of them are the same. And there's lots of options. Most of them require the soul to continue on, but sort of tellingly in the Apology, he does bring up the idea that death is just the end, that there's nothing after death, that your light goes out or whatever, and that's it. And he doesn't seem bothered by that either. right? Some of the other options might be more appealing or attractive or exciting. I was like the sort of cocktail party in the underworld at the end of the apology, right, where you get to go and question all the old heroes and people like that. That sounds like a fun time, but to him, it doesn't seem to make any difference, right? Whether, he gets to do that or if he's no longer aware, right? Either way, it's nothing to be afraid of, right? So long as you've lived your life properly, then death shouldn't be something to be afraid of. And so, the whole question of do you have to believe that the soul is immortal for that to pay off? I think it just makes it more appealing to people. I think it makes it easier for people to buy into that, because that gives you a reward at the end, right? If you live a good life, you're going to have this great afterlife, and your soul will be purified and go to the realm of the forms, and everything will be clear to you, and you'll know all the things you want to know, and that would be really great. But for Socrates, either way, it seems, he doesn't think we should be afraid of death. So make of that what you will.
Well, thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you, Robert, for your question. And now comes we're at 1:30 or 1:31. So I've asked you all to, I've let you unmute yourself. So now let's unmute ourselves and give our speaker a round of applause.
Thank you very much. That was very, very good.
Very well.
Thanks,
Thank
Zoe.
you. Thanks,
Thank
Zoe.
you.
So great.
Zoe.
Nicely done.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.